Okay. Good morning, gentlemen. I noticed no ladies, but I think we've got to work on that a bit more in our industry, but that's another story. I wanted to talk to you about international construction measurement standards today because it brings together three things that are very important for the RICS. One is data and technology and the future surrounding data and technology in terms of the surveying profession. One is infrastructure and the fact that that sector is obviously going to be an important place for chartered surveyors working in the next 10 to 15 years, both in this country and overseas. And thirdly, the whole concept of international standards as a global professional institution and how we promote those going forward and how we use them in the industry and why they're important in the UK as an economy that's going to be looking towards more international connections in the next few years, obviously, post-Brexit, and why we think it's the future for the chartered surveying profession as well. So let me begin with just an outline of what I'm going to talk about quickly over the next 30 minutes. I'm aware that some of you in this room know a lot about this standard already, and certainly Tollis has worked with us on it, and one or two other people in the room have been involved in it as well. So it's very much an overview presentation, and it will provoke, I'm sure, some questions in your mind about it. And that's why I'm very keen to get some dialogue today, but probably more importantly, on reflection. If you want to get involved in this standard, or if you want to know more about it when it's published in July, please do contact me separately after this presentation today, because really in half an hour I can only give you an overview. So today I want to just talk about international standards in context, the problem that ICMS is trying to solve in the marketplace, what ICMS actually aims to do as a standard, and then what RICS will do as a member of this collaborative coalition that set the standard with its own standards in the UK and elsewhere as a result of the publication of ICMS. So just international standards in context. International standards, I've got to admit, are a bit of a dry subject and don't perhaps get the prominence that they deserve, although it's interesting that the Brexit negotiations are bringing the importance of standards more to the fore in terms of trade deals and how we actually do business with each other. But I wanted to draw your attention to something, first of all, called the International Financial Reporting Standards, because that's an example of a profession, the accountancy profession, coming together and setting an international standard that's actually had some effect. Now, there are other reasons why the negative reporting on balance sheets has improved markedly since the world financial crisis, obviously, but one of the reasons that it has improved markedly, as shown by this chart, is actually because of the International Financial Reporting Standard that was put together in 2008-2009, post the world financial crisis. And so it's an important pretext for the effect international standards can have on the working of a profession. And I think it's also well known from various economies around the world that international standards and standards in general do have an effect on economic growth. So there's a quote there from the Canadian government, there's a quote from the UK government. I won't go into the detail of that because that's obviously standards in general. But the interesting point about this is that I think professional work processes are the new frontier for standards, because a lot of standards have been concerned with materials, production, manufacturing in the past. But professional work processes, and the accountants are an example of that, haven't really been standardised to the same extent on a global basis, and particularly where they're collecting data, which the collection of which will be more important in the technological age I think we're about to embark upon. So, also, some of the NGOs in the world, such as the World Bank, are quite convinced that improving regulation and improving work processes and standardising work processes in this way will lead to improved decision making, improved market efficiency and market growth. So the major NGOs, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, to name but two, are very much behind the introduction of these international standards. And from an RICS point of view, we're obviously quite a broad church. We cover land, property and construction, and we're putting ethics and professionalism at the centre of what we do because we feel that is the core of professionalism. And valuation that transcends most of our disciplines at the RICS is obviously an important international standard in its own right. And the Red Book now has been established in the international marketplace for some years as an international standard in market valuation. But in addition to that, we want to look at the three areas that we cover, which are basically land, property and construction, and develop international standards in those areas. So ICMS is obviously a construction standard, but it's part of a overall suite of international standards which the RICS is now involved in. And they hope to produce an international land measurement standard which covers property rights in land. An international property measurement standard is already well underway and in fact started before ICMS and covers standardisation in the way that you measure the floor areas of buildings. And ICMS, which I'm going to come on to now. So, international construction costs, the issue is becoming more important because of the amount of construction that the world economy has to build over the next 15 to 20 years. And regardless of the cycles in different economies of the world, there are some trends which are not going away, and one of the trends is urbanisation, as highlighted in our futures report. So the trend towards 10 million plus cities in China, for example, and the new cities that will be created by the One Belt, One Road policy in China and other parts of the world is not going away. Urbanisation will increase, and urbanisation brings increased need for construction and efficiencies in construction. And at the same time, notwithstanding the professionalism that's sat in this room, we have problems in delivering construction on time to cost. We still have problems, and some of these astonishing statistics that are on this graph show the extent of that problem. I mean, cost overruns and time overruns in construction are still very common, particularly in the developing and emerging world, but even in the mature economy world as well. So not only do we have to build a lot of construction, but we have to get better at building it. And more particularly in cost classification and measurement in construction, the BCIS, the Building Cost Information Service, which, as you know, is part of the RICS, conducted an extensive survey in 2009 and found that not only do cost measurement systems differ widely around the world, in fact to the point where what's included in a construction cost might vary by 30%, but also in some mature and developing economies of the world there is no cost classification system at all. So whereas we've had well-developed standard methods of measurement in both buildings and infrastructure, some economies of the world haven't really had that kind of approach to this at all. So any standard is better than no standard in these developing economies. And some of these well-respected economic organisations are on the case with this as well. I mean, there was a recent report from the World Economic Forum called Shaping the Future of Construction, which concluded, and the quote is there, "The standard definition of cost, classification and measurements along the whole life cycle will lead to greater comparability and compatibility among projects." And this is not something that's ethereal or esoteric. This is something that was in their a major recommendation in their executive summary. And also a recent report issued by McKinsey Global Institute, which was talking about productivity in construction, reinventing construction, a route to higher productivity. Encouraging transparency in cost and performance, as the ICMS project does, is important to achieve that increased productivity in construction. So the problem in construction and what people want to do about it has been well set. And I just wanted to emphasise the point that in terms of a largely UK audience today, which I understand, you know, we've got in the room, that the problem is not somewhere else. As I said at the beginning, the UK economy has to be, actually I would say, more international in its outlook in terms of the post-Brexit world. And the National Audit Office recently concluded that performance that put in place the systems and data which allow proper performance measurement. And when we went to see the National Audit Office about ICMS, they were very keen on the fact that this standard would allow international comparisons, because I know we've got a couple of gentlemen from HS2 in the room, and it may have been embryonic, but I know a lot of the political debate at the beginning of the HS2 budget setting was about international comparison and valid international comparison. So what does ICMS aim to do? Well, it aims to set a simple, high-level cost classification that can connect to national standards and sit at the top of the pyramid, if you like, in terms of the data hierarchy of cost classification and cost benchmarking around the world. So today, if you want to compare costs in different countries, you do not necessarily know what's included in the construction cost that you've picked up from an analysis and there is no standardised way of recording that cost on different projects around the world. And this is not just buildings I'm talking about, this is infrastructure and civil engineering as well. So by developing this international standard, we are taking away one of the imponderables, if you like, in terms of that comparison. Now, other problems still exist, such as comparing on a like-for-like specification, although ICMS actually helps here because along with the costs, we set a number of what we call values and attributes which define the scheme in terms of basic fundamental cost drivers and specification. But also, we've got the issue of currency conversion, which is an economics issue and is not a quantity surveying issue, which still exists. But nevertheless, professional judgment can use information available to make that comparison. And if we've got an international standard in place which is collecting the data in the same form, which is able to be compared using currency conversions, then that's a step forward, and that's what ICMS is aiming to achieve. We're also linking it to international property measurement standards in terms of buildings, because if we've clarified how you measure floor areas for buildings on an international basis, then clearly one of the major determinants of cost of a building is floor area. So by linking ICMS to IPMS on floor areas, we're beginning to connect some of these standards we're talking about. And actually, I think this is important in terms of connecting on a global basis, but also between different sectors of our industry, because the property industry has tended to do different things with areas than the construction industry, and in fact measure them in different ways, and therefore connecting across disciplines as well as connecting across markets is the aim of these standards. So ICMS, and this is quite high level, but it sets a hierarchy of basically project types in yellow, and that includes buildings, as you can see, and some of the major civil engineering types. And it will be extended at a later date to cover wider civil engineering types, but those are the basic ones as a Lego kit that you can use to build up most major international projects. And actually that's quite interesting, because most major international projects do consist of a mixture of buildings and infrastructure, as we know. And yet the way we look at the profession at the moment, we tend to divide between cost engineering and cost management, commercial management, quantity surveying. So the other interesting thing about this standard in terms of the financial management of construction is that it becomes more unifying in terms of its nomenclature and terminology for the profession. And a bit like the accounting profession have done, and the legal profession and the medical profession, it's also about unifying the profession on a global basis, this. Because I go to different countries around the world, and quantity surveying is essentially the same, but it's not called the same thing, and they think it's something different. Well, actually the competencies, when you analyse them, are essentially the same. So I think it's very important for our profession to be more unified on a global basis. And also this kind of way that we can nest sub-projects. So you've got a simple hierarchy where you can nest multiple projects in terms of coming back to a major project, having various sub-projects. So an airport's obviously got buildings and runways and all the other various types, but you could obviously build up a project in this simple hierarchical way. And we use cost categories and cost subgroups, which, by the way, are not elemental, because we found that elemental is used in some parts of the world that got ties to the British way of doing things, if you like, but it wasn't universally used, and we also couldn't use it to make the bridge, no pun intended, to infrastructure, because what we found was that when people were looking at work breakdown structures in infrastructure, for example, we needed some kind of more flexible way of allocating costs. So this is a little bit contentious even for the RICS, because what we're saying is that we'll have to change our own standards to make it accord with ICMS. But the point about the standard is it's simple, it's overarching, it's able to be translated well. It combines design classification and cost classification, which we think is important for the future of BIM as well. Because you'll all be aware in this country that actually designers, architects and engineers use different classifications to construction economists, if you want to call them that, in terms of building information modelling, which is a problem in this country. You know, we've got Uniclass and we've got NRM and we've got CESM, and we've got all these different classifications that don't necessarily talk to each other. So another advantage of ICMS is that it begins to bring this debate together between the engineers and between the designers and the business managers, if you like. So that's an example of a page of values and attributes for one of the project types. So when I said before that we specify the main cost drivers, we're looking at benchmarking the main functional units of the scheme and identifying the key elements of each particular project type. So it was always a balance between providing enough detail but not providing too much detail. So this is not a method of measurement. I mean, the measurement in the title is a slight misnomer, because I don't want you to think about standard method of measurement or the new rules of measurement, because it's not that granular level of detail. It's a very high level cost classification system. And I just put this slide on because Turner and Townsend, I don't know if there's anybody from Turner and Townsend in the room, but they issued a very worthwhile report called International Construction Market Survey very recently, which just happens to be ICMS by another name. But actually in the report, if you look at the methodology section at the back, they do. I have quoted them in terms of this paragraph here. And one of the things they say that there is no method of standardising cost reporting on a global basis. So you know, some of the major reports that are already produced acknowledge that this is a major problem for them already. And I just want to talk a little bit about how ICMS was developed, because I think it's important. It is not an RICS standard. It was developed with 45 other professional institutions around the world. So the Chinese Engineering Cost Association, the American Association for Cost Engineering, the construction economists in Europe, the Canadians, the Australians, they were all involved in this. And when I first got involved in this, because I sat on the committee that developed it, I thought it might be a bit of a nightmare. But actually, one of the reasons it wasn't a nightmare was because we separated the politics from the standard setting. So these coalitions have a trustee, which they nominate, and they discuss the project in communication terms and in general political terms. They nominated one expert. They could nominate one expert to sit on the standard setting committee. So I represent the RICS, and all the other major professional institutions in the coalition are recognised and represented. And basically they had a brief that was agreed by the trustees in terms of what they wanted to produce, but they were left to get on with it as technical standard setters. And we worked very well together, and it was a great team effort. And in fact, Tollis was involved in that as well, and I hope you'd recognise that as well, Tollis. It was a great team effort. So the standard was first put together. We initiated the project. The project on the left was the coalition meeting at the International Monetary Fund in June 2015. And the photograph on the right is a meeting of the Standard Setting Committee at the European Commission in February this year. So we met a few times face to face. We did a lot of virtual phone calls around the world as well. And we produced a draft basically 1 year after we initiated it in June 2016. And since then we've gone through a number of public consultations. So the current status of ICMS is that it's been through a private consultation round about third quarter last year. It then went through a first public consultation the end of last year stroke beginning of this year, and we've just recently concluded a second public consultation so that we can produce and publish the standard by July this year. It will be launched at the Pacific Association of Quantity Surveyors annual or biannual conference in Vancouver at the end of July. So we've chosen to launch it there because it just happened to be a big World QS event around about the time of publication. So it's coming, it's almost there. RICS proposals after ICMS. Well, we want to look at how it affects the new rules of measurement, and we want to obviously it will supersede the principles of measurement international. When I went to the Middle East a few months ago, I was quite surprised actually. A number of practitioners in the Middle East are still using POMI. So, you know, and that was published in 1979. So we need to get rid of that because it's not relevant in the marketplace anymore. And in this country, I think there are two issues. One is, as the RICS, we need to update NRM anyway because there's been a new RIBA plan of work issued since it was published in 2013. There have been various other errata that have been raised by various professionals using it. But more importantly, we need to show how it maps to ICMS at a high level. So NRM2, it's not going to affect much at all because that's a trade-by-trade analysis and quite detailed. NRM1 and 3, which is based on an elemental cost planning system, will be affected, and we envisage dual reporting perhaps initially, but we hope that the international standard will supersede high-level reporting in terms of NRM as well, and we will be making those changes over the course of the next year. We also intend to produce a new project which is like a mezzanine standard or an intermediate standard, which is more detailed than ICMS but less detailed than NRM, and what this will be is a global cost planning standard which fits between the two, and that will reinforce our global credentials in terms of setting standards for the profession. So the analogy here is with the Code of Measuring Practice, because after IPMS was produced, the RICS changed its Code of Measuring Practice to accord with IPMS, and that's now been published, as I put on the slide there. So you can see that RICS, as a member of the coalition, and all the coalition members have agreed to do this, will amend our own standards to accord with the international standards, because that pyramidal flow of data is what we're trying to achieve here, from an overarching global setting down to national economies and upwards again. And so it's put simply there, ICMS at the top of the pyramid, professional statement, which is this intermediate standard, and then national guidance. That's our plan. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that I think this international standard is important for three main reasons. One is I think it really is a unifying the profession, increasing the global demand for the profession, explaining to clients better what the profession does, and I think that's much needed in, to use this generic term, the financial management of construction. You know, cost engineers and other people around the world all think they do something slightly different, but actually our core raison d'etre is the financial management of construction across civil engineering and buildings, and we should do more to unify that profession as an international and professional global organisation. I think it's important in terms of future regulation of the profession on an international basis, because at the moment, quite frankly, we can only regulate the profession on a national basis. And I think it's about the 21st century profession, as I started at the beginning, in terms of data, in terms of the use of that data and collection of that data. By the way, we do intend to make ICMS in XML format, and we're looking at putting some kind of globalized website system for data collection. So that's something else we're considering. We want to work closely with the software vendors like Nomatech in terms of development of the standards. So this has been very much developed in conjunction with the software industry, which I have to say in the past we perhaps haven't done as much of that as we should have. So those are the timescales which I've discussed. Although the public consultation's over, some of you are new to ICMS. I would encourage you to get involved, as I said at the beginning. Have a look at the website. There's more information on those, including a long list of frequently asked questions. That's the coalition website. And if you've got any particular questions that you don't get answered today or asked today, please feel free to send me an email. The important point is that even when this standard's published, that we see it as a dynamic standard, because it's the first time our profession's done anything like this. So we want feedback from the market. We want to continue to shape the standard. We want to expand the standard as well. We're already talking about looking at whole life cycle costings, for example, because at the moment the standard just deals with capital costs. We had to start somewhere. It's very much a first step. So please get involved. Thank you. Any questions? Martin.
We've always struggled.
Sorry.
Yeah. One of the things we've always struggled within the industry is the behaviours of the supply chain. How do we get the supply chain to adopt the standards as well? Because often they work with their own internal systems, their own internal cost management and cost reporting systems, and they don't usually allocate cost in the same way we'd want to collect it and manage it and report it.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think there are a number of ways we can tackle that. One is, as a profession, I do think that we need to put a plan in place, if you like, because I think one of the issues has been that there hasn't been this clarity of strategy of standards. For example, let's take infrastructure. I mean, we've got even in this country, we've got the civil engineering standard method of measurement. We've got the rail industry about to produce their own. We've had highways, method of measurement. ACOST produced some method of measurements. So we've got a whole, I think, slightly confusing picture in terms of cost measurement standards in the UK even. So I think we need, first of all, we need some clarity about how these standards connect together and about what the important information is. Whereas at the same time, I agree that in certain subsectors we also need the granular level of detail, and that's why the rail industries, for example, has gone down that route, because they haven't had that level of detail. So we've got to start, I think, with a strategy that people can see how this data connects, but at the same time encourage the extended supply chain to collect the data in the level of detail they want, and then use modern technology to map across more. Because I think we've been too rigid in terms of trying to push down the supply chain what's agreed at higher level. I mean, anybody who's involved in quantity surveying and financial management in this room knows that the kind of calculations and analysis that's done at embryonic benchmarking level is a long way from what a subcontractor requires in terms of pricing his works. And we've got to connect those data issues more. And I think we can do that with technology, and with the emergence of BIM. I think it's quite exciting in that regard, because the mapping across different data sets can be done easier, manipulated easier. But I think unless we've got a strategy and a way to show how that data connects down the supply chain, people won't get it. They won't use it, and more importantly, they won't adopt it. Because I think the other important thing about this is, governments and others, particularly in infrastructure, which is mainly led by the public sector, adopting these standards and making them, even if they don't say you must use it, they must say that they give it their full support. Because I think we saw what happened with the level 2 mandate, and a lot of people, there's a lot of politics involved in whether that was successful or not, but the fact is it did nudge the market on. And I think, it's incumbent upon people who are interested in getting better data to better predict costs, such as the National Audit Office that I mentioned, getting involved in this more and sort of saying, well, we think you should be using this. We think this strategy is right in terms of data and cost hierarchy. But first of all, we need a data and cost hierarchy that works. I mentioned those standards in infrastructure because I have discussed with the ICE and the CICES, and in fact Network Rail, about coming together a bit more in that regard and trying to put some unified standard in place just in terms of UK civil engineering. Because what we want, what's in it for us there, if you like, is that that will allow a connection with ICMS as well, better than it does at the moment. So I think it's about having a strategy about unifying the standards and about showing the relevance, but also about getting some real adoption in the marketplace from the large players and from government organisations. Yeah.
We cracked that each road. We've written our standards, haven't we? Our facility deck. We've nailed that triangle.
Right. Okay.
Collect data.
Excellent. Yeah.
But have you been to the water industries? If you were to go where the funding comes from, that will give you the cost breakdown structure.
And certainly, I know it's a highly regulated sector who've sorted it out, as it were.
Yeah.
We're not. We don't want to get in the way what people are doing in those sectors, because some of them have done really good jobs. We appreciate that. What we're saying is that we need some kind of connecting between the data at a high level, international level, and that level. And if we require some rationalisation and consolidation in the infrastructure sector in terms of these standards, then we can act as a facilitator to bring that together. And I think one of the things that we keep saying at the RICS is that in buildings, business management became quite popular alongside architects. In infrastructure, it's not become popular enough yet. But it's probably incumbent upon this professional institution to push that agenda as much as anybody else. And when I speak to the ICE and CICES about that, they're quite open about it and they want us to get involved. So we're quite happy to get involved. Yeah.
A couple of things.
Yeah, sure.
The first one's not really a question, it's an observation.
Right.
One of your very early slides was about cost overruns in construction.
Yes.
I'm really interested
Yes.
in infrastructure. That's very significant. But I think we don't do ourselves any favours keep publicising the big cost overruns. The issue in estimating that I see is that we don't understand risk and uncertainty early enough in the project life cycle. Therefore, we quote figures, or allow figures to be quoted, which have inadequate allowances for risk and uncertainty. And it isn't actually that the scheme has changed, and it's that we haven't allowed enough for the uncertainty in design and the risks that are around that. Now, sometimes the reasons for that are actually political. We don't want to say what the true cost of this scheme might be.
No.
It may well kill the scheme off in the early days.
No, no.
I think there's a big opportunity there for the RICS to lead on research in that risk and uncertainty area.
I completely agree with you, Martin. And when I was in practice, I remember times when optimism bias, I think, is the term, that people wouldn't have got the project unless they felt very optimistic about what the price was. But I also feel that there's a major problem for the profession there, because certainly in the private sector, people say to the QS profession, I'm paying you to give me the cost. I don't want to know that it's plus or minus 30%. That's no good to me, because I'm a developer and I've got to make a decision about what the cost is. So there's a major issue in terms of evidence for what we produce. And I think we can only begin to solve that evidence by getting better data, actually.
Agreed.
Yeah,
That's my point, really.
yeah.
We need more research on gathering that evidence.
Absolutely, yeah.
That was an observation. The second one, really interested in your comment about moving to the next level of the standard, which I think we call a global cost planning standard.
Yes.
So what is the timescale for that? That's what I would like to see. I mean, I love the structure. The high-level structure is fine, but if you go to the bit that I'm interested in, it's a box which says railways. And,
Yeah.
it's moving to that next level that we need to address. So what is the timescale around that?
I can't actually give you a precise timescale. I'm not being political about it. It's just that it hasn't been signed off, as it were, in terms of a new project proposal, and we haven't even got a working group together yet who would set the standard, because we need the right people on that group, obviously. But what I would say is that I had a discussion about it last week to sort of kick it off internally, and we are definitely going to do it. I think we'll start it. Our business year runs from end of June to the next July, so I think we'll start it in our next business year, which is basically next month after the ICMS is published. I think we'll get the group together, and then I don't know, it's probably a year to 18 months to do the work, that kind of order. So by mid-2018, coming up to 2019, I guess we'll have something, Martin, yeah.
Right, okay. I think we could move probably quite quickly if the right people were there in the infrastructure sector. I could look around. If you take the railways box, you can quickly go to the next level of components in that box fairly quickly in railways, track signalling, or railway train control and so on. You can get to those next headings quite quickly. And I believe that in itself would be of value, because some simple measurement rules then around those big boxes would solve the issues we have in international benchmarking immediately.
Okay, yeah. I'm sure you're right. As I said, in terms of the standard setting committee, when you get the right people around the table, you can do it very quickly. And I think that's a good point vis-a-vis, some other action in this space from the International Standards Organisation. I don't want to decry that process, but we kind of wondered whether international standards should be done more in that style. And then we found out that it takes them 7 or 8 years. But they've got a very fairly rigid process that they go through. I mean, my view is if you get the right professionals around the table who have the right knowledge and the right perspectives and are fairly open-minded, then you can do these quite quickly. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, also kind of related to what the question Martin had, because TfL is trying to get these standard work items and whatnot to be able to do benchmarking. Is there also going to be an effort to do standardized cost drivers, so that you can do relative comparison benchmarking across?
Well, I think the cost planning standard that Martin and I have just been discussing must look at that issue. Yes, I mean we must go down to the next level of detail in terms of the different sectors and find out what the major cost drivers are for each of those sectors. That must be done in the cost planning standard that I've just been talking about. I think. Yeah.
Can I just go back to Phil's point about supply chain? I think although I can agree with your observations about explaining standards and all that, but it's also about getting the supply chain involved. So it's good to see that you're talking to other professional institutes, but they don't represent the supply chain.
No.
If you want to get it adopted, you've got to go to the supply chain associations, you know, the various trade bodies and all that represent the supply chains, and get them involved. I would also suggest that determining construction measurement is one aspect, but the more important aspect for the supply chain is what the last point was about. It's about actually understanding the cost drivers, understanding what develops cost, how cost is developed, what the commercial implications are in terms of the various contracting strategies and all that. That's what the supply chain are interested in. And until you kind of tie that up with the measurement standard you have now, I think it's going to be difficult to get the supply chain truly engaged and truly interested in this.
I take your point. I mean, just dissecting it a little bit, I think, first of all lines of communication are open as far as we're concerned. You know, when we put together this 45-strong coalition, that was done on an international basis. But in terms of the UK, we're quite happy to talk to anybody about these standards. And you're right about the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, for example, have expressed an interest, but we haven't had too many discussions with them yet. We want to discuss this standard far and wide with as many people as we can, essentially. And I think what we're hoping is that, you know, the tier ones will become more, the tier ones on the contracting side will become more involved in this discussion, because one of the problems we've got sometimes, I think, when we talk about high-level standards is that the contractors don't think it's for them, or they don't think it's part of their workload. But actually, I do think with increasingly early contractor involvement, early supply chain engagement, and particularly when that's done in a BIM environment, that people need to understand the standards that the informed clients are interested in, and the front-end professional, if you like, is interested in, because this is informing the whole data collection process in terms of cost prediction on subsequent projects, but also cost collection on that project. So I think, you know, that kind of process, as I understand it, is happening on some projects, perhaps exemplar projects at the moment, but it's certainly the way the government wants to go in terms of early contractor involvement. So I use this term, which might be quite contentious, about the professionalisation of contractors. I think the professionalisation of contractors is something that they want to do because they come and speak to us about it. They want their professionals to be RICS qualified and professionally qualified, in which case they need to be interested in this kind of issue as well. Because, and again, this might be slightly contentious, but in my view, some of the professionals that they've traditionally employed have not really had this front-end expertise that they perhaps need in their new roles. And so financial management looked at from a different perspective and connecting it with what they do need in a commercial management situation is perhaps their next challenge. And I think that if they get it, then they can then explain it more to their extended supply chain, that it's really important to do it in this form and in this way, because this way we can move forward in terms of data. But I don't disagree with you that it's a problem. You know, it's a problem because we've got many people who are looking at the industry through different lenses and perspectives in terms of the way they use that data, and I think some people just need to get the next job done, and they haven't got time perhaps to look at it in the way that some other people are considering it. But we need to. It's a continual discussion that we need to have, I think, and I think if we work. And I don't want to say down the industry, but if we work along the industry, and first of all, clients and end users understand the value of it, and then you know, professionals and tier one contractors understand the value of it, then eventually the message will get to the supply chain because they want to work with those people.
So in the water industry, they are quite advanced, because Southern Trade use their cost model to set target costs with the contractors.
Yes, yeah.
That is their target cost.
And I believe
they understand what's in it because they have to deliver against it.
And I believe that works well. Yes, I mean, Stephen Blakey also from Network Rail was showing me a lot of information where he's done similar things with his supply chain. So I think particularly in infrastructure where you've got a number of major clients, if you like, it's a bit different to the building industry, but in infrastructure where you've got a number of major clients who are quasi or public sector clients, that they have this power. They do have this power to do this. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
I still think you're approaching it from a top-down perspective. You're saying, as a client and as a professional institute, this cost structure is important. But what you're not doing is looking at it from the bottom up, saying what is important, what does drive the cost, why is it important to look at it, the cost in that way. I'm just suggesting that.
Yeah. Sorry, I should slightly change my answer because it is important what comes bottom up as well. But what I said to the gentleman earlier was that I think we need a strategy. Otherwise, it all becomes a mishmash of different standards in the marketplace. I think we need a strategy. But I do think that bottom-up data is very important as well. I think with technology the way it's going, that this issue that's been a little bit artificial in the industry about that data won't speak to that data or that's in a different box to that box will kind of begin to disappear. Because, I don't know, Tollis, if you've got any comment on this, but...
Not something. We tried with the ICMS to make it database friendly. So unlike Fomi where everybody can write whatever he wants, we tried to have a specific set of attributes so it's consistent and it can be put in a database. So at least we try to make sure this with the ICMS. I think this will make the standard more easy for the lower guys, for the everyday guys, when they have to select and click one thing rather than looking and printing books and how to describe this. We hope it's going to make it more easy.
Yeah.
But of course, they need to get engaged.
Yeah.
How to get engaged, it's a strategy now.
A lot of it is that they're in a competitive market. So they need to find a way how do they become that a little bit better than the next one in their supply chain. How to leverage in their supply chain themselves in the levels 2s and 3s. And if if everybody describes a tin of beans exactly the same way, what's their unique selling point? How are they going to differentiate themselves between everybody else? And I think that's the challenge you're going to get. It's a behavioural thing. And that's the hardest thing. You've got to change the culture of people.
Yeah, exactly. That's the biggest challenge.
You can write,
I think that's the biggest challenge.
but then there's the cultural piece that has to be changed and come along with it.
And to need management, pushing them.
Well, if you look at publicly funded projects in the US, one thing I haven't seen over here used as much is that publicly funded projects in the US actually write incentives and award fee in terms into their contracts. And they'll actually, and they'll review those every year. And they'll come in and say, you must meet these criteria, and based on these criteria, they'll weight each of them. That'll determine how much profit and fee you get off of this. And so it actually drives that good behavior. And you're not locked into what you agree the first year, because you agree something the first year, and the second year, you re-review those, and they make updates to that list, and reprioritize things, depending on whether you get the good data from the subcontractors or not. So it's a way to kind of help drive that behavior and give them an incentive, an award, for actually meeting what you want. And I'm surprised I haven't seen it in the contracts over here.
But the American, especially the government procurement, they use their costing pricing techniques. They don't have to equal risk, it's called profit. Depending on the level of risk they have, there is the profit margins they go for. And that's when you do your target setting in your government contracts, they're very, like I said, they do use the data.
Yeah.
But usually there's still an element of risk. And they don't have things like risk and contingency. It usually goes into the contractor's risk, into contractor's profit margin and say, well, if this is a high risk project, I'm going to want this level of profit.
Well, sometimes it's not. Actually, in some public projects, they do use risk contingency. It does vary a bit. And the fact that they have standard reports that come out, they're basically MC standards and they actually have a line item for those.
I think the other thing it's got to work, and I think a lot of infrastructure clients, is we've got to get better in our scoping. And that's where, like you say, something like cost overruns is usually immature scope. They've gone to market, they've gone to contract, an immature scope, and all of a sudden, we've got this cost overrun. It's not about the data, it's actually the client wasn't mature enough in his scope definitions.
Quite.
So that's got to be another driving force that you've got to set this up.
Absolutely, and in fact, in terms of referring back to the internationalisation of the profession, you know, we want to, you're aware that in quantity surveying we've got something called the Black Book, which was a series of guidance notes and infrastructure guidance in like the informed client piece, for example. What we want to do is internationalise that as well. We've got to take out all the reference to UK legislation and UK references, but we want to internationalise that as well. So this is only one part of the jigsaw puzzle for the financial management of construction, but if we're going to be taken seriously in that regard, then we need to actually put down the principles of what we believe is good total cost management, if you like, to use that term which the Americans like.
And to say that, we're taking the point about engaging the supply chain. I think there are some good examples of that in infrastructure, and maybe we do ourselves a disservice here. We're not publicising it enough. I can only talk about the TfL position, and if I look at track in TfL, we've been in partnership with a major civil engineering contractor for in excess of 5 years, and our cost structures that we're using are actually developed, engaged directly with the civil engineering contractor. So there are some really good examples of bottom up and top down, and those two things coming together. And perhaps we don't, I would take the point, we don't perhaps seek to actively make sure those suppliers are involved in the forum. I mean, I think that particular supplier would be very happy to be sat in this kind of forum and cooperating and be involved.
But would he be happy to sit in that same forum with his competitors?
That's
and having that same open conversation.
Yeah, but I think that's where you got to kind of put that aside. That cost as a pure subject is common throughout the supply chain. You know, at the end of the day, it's about materials, labour, plant, overheads, and all that. It's how it comes out. You only have to look at, say, the manufacturing industry or the defence industry, and the way how they look at cost. You know, they're constantly looking at manufacturing. You know, looks at tenths of a penny in terms of manufacturing cost per component on an industry-wide basis, looking for, you know, how do they reduce the cost to remain competitive.
Yeah, and your point, your earlier point about sort of methodology and how you actually do the work as well as what you do, I think is an important point in infrastructure. You know, we've tried to capture some of that information in values and attributes, but that's the kind of bottom-up data that I think will inform. You know, as I said at the beginning, I think this standard is dynamic. I think it will be shaped in the future, but I think it's a first step. We've got to start somewhere. No. It's a good point though about methodology.
Yeah, what I'm saying is the key point I'm trying to make is construction measurement, however you call it, is one thing.
Yeah.
Actually understanding cost as a pure subject as to where you incur cost, how you incur cost, and what drives cost is a totally different subject from how you measure quantity.
Yeah, sure.
And until you put those two together, you will never have the complete answer.
No. We want, of course, ICMS to be used by a qualified construction professional, and that's the point of it in a way. So, and RICS has always been an individual membership. So, you know, when we can talk about this at a corporate level, obviously, and that's important, but basically 80% of RICS membership are SMEs. And I was in Manchester last week, and you know, most of the firms that were listening to me doing a similar presentation was saying, well, we're in the extended supply chain, you know, what do we get this for? So I had a similar discussion about that issue, and I think that is an important point. Yeah.
I think it's an important point, mainly because when you look around the room and you look at the hair colour of most people's salaries, you know, the understanding of first principles in terms of estimating your cost is almost vanished from this industry. Now, I have to put my cards on the table. I've only recently come back to the UK industry, construction industry, after 20 odd years, and I'm absolutely shocked at the low level of understanding of cost as a pure subject. I've got people come to me, you know, saying, I've got two rates. One is £6 a cubic metre, the other's £250 a cubic metre, which one should I use? And I said, well, work it out from first principles.
Mm.
How do I do that?
Mm.
And I'm talking about a 40-year-old man,
Mm. Right.
not an 18-year-old graduate or
Sure.
20-year-old graduate. Until you put those first principles back in,
Mm.
and to me, I'm hugely concerned because we're losing those first principles and we've become obsessed with data.
Mm.
Data is different to information.
Mm.
First principles is information. Data is just streams of ones and zeros. And it's not telling you what you need to know.
Mm.
It's just people looking at a screen, looking at interesting sort of diagrams and charts and all that. But it's not really telling them what they need to know. What you need to know is understanding the core principles, the first principles of how cost is derived. And until we get that, until you can implement that into the sort of training regimes, the learning regimes of graduates, then I'm afraid to say we're in for some really hard times over the next 10 to 20 years because, you know, people like me will be gone.
Mm. Well,
People will
no. No, it's a fair point. I mean, all I can say is that the APC, to become a chartered quantity surveyor, still requires that kind of analysis of first principle rates. Now, you know, that's something that we think is fairly core to the profession in terms of understanding the information that you've got. It's a valid point. And I do think, though, that alongside that, we've got to also look at data science as a subject. And this is partly about, you know, new technologies come in whether we like it or not. And it's about how that new technology can manipulate data and how we can use it as a profession to our advantage. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't understand the principles of how that data is arrived at. And certainly a professional, you know, a professional who's trained in the right way should be able to do that. I agree.
I'd reinforce what you were saying there, because obviously travelling around I see loads of companies, and especially the regional contractors, and often they'll say, I'm looking for an estimator, do you know anybody? I think, probably find someone, so will there be a proper estimator? You know, or just someone who goes together. Yeah, and I'm not sure it's been taught.
No.
What are the first principles stuff
Mm.
anymore.
I don't think it's being taught at all. Recently we've been looking at developing an estimator training program, and that's amazingly difficult to find that. There's an offer in the UK, almost.
And then you've got to find somebody to teach it.
Yeah, yes, and then we've all got grey hair.
Well, come to us, Martin. Perhaps we can offer some training in it.
Yeah, well, I think the RSS could take the lead in that area, and in infrastructure in particular.
Okay.
Thank you, Alan.